Hi, everyone. Welcome to Anthro to UX Video Podcast. Today I'll be talking with Rachel Fleming, who I'm very glad to have here. Rachel is a design researcher at Idea Couture, which is a cognizant digital business. And so, Rachel, I'm really thankful to have you here. I appreciate all the work you've done in this space so far. I've read some of your articles, and I know that you're passionate about helping other people get into UX from anthropology. So thanks, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Great. Thanks for having me. Yeah. This is fantastic.
So, tell me a little bit about yourself, how you sort of got to the role you're in today, a little background on your education and, maybe just a little bit of the backstory.
Sure. Well, I discovered anthropology way back in undergrad and found it was a good fit for kind of understanding patterns about the world and getting to talk to people, find out what's actually going on. And I kind of hemmed and hawed about going to grad school and took a detour into urban planning because I wanted to do something a little more practical. Got very interested in kind of work and the meaning of work, and then realized I wanted to go back and study that as an anthropologist. So I ended up in a PhD program at the University of Colorado Boulder and did a project in India on women who are in tech jobs there in Bangalore. And Bangalore is kind of the tech center of India. These jobs have not been around for very long. And so I really looked at kind of the generational impact of women having access to jobs that they hadn't had in generations past, and what that meant for gender equity, and also why their attrition was so high. They tend to leave jobs quite quickly. And very briefly, it was because of many factors, but partly unexpected sexism and kind of blocks to progress in the office that they didn't think would happen in tech. So during that project and during grad school, I was a little bit agnostic about going into academia. I thought, if it works out, okay, it could be an interesting job, but I really liked the applied side of research, and I knew that there were other anthropologists who'd done this before. So I got involved with EPIC, Ethnographic Praxis and Industry Conference. While I was still in grad school, I talked to a couple of anthropologists who'd done this before. I remember very early conversations with Melissa Sefkin and Donna Flynn that kind of set me on this path. And even before I did my fieldwork. And so I came back and wrote up my dissertation and thought, well, maybe I'll give it a try. By that time, this was maybe 4 years ago or so, the business anthropology world had really become UX research or user experience research. And so, anthropologists have been studying organizations and business for a very long time, but it kind of become more important in a digital product sense to talk to people who are using products. So I jumped off the deep end into UX research, did a couple of kind of volunteer projects to get a little experience under my belt, and I can talk more about that later if you'd like, and got my first job at a custom software development agency, and I've been going since then.
Cool. Yeah, so talk a little bit more, you mentioned the volunteering project. So one of the things that when people reach out to me, they're always asking is, how do I get to have a portfolio? And I oftentimes do suggest, if you can volunteer anywhere for a local nonprofit, whatever it may be, or if you can find a project even in your own organization, whether that's in school or at your employer, whatever it may be, find a small project and start there to kind of get some wins under your belt in a portfolio. So how did you find these volunteer opportunities, and what was your pitch to sort of get your foot in the door?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was, it took it was a bit of a slog at the beginning and did not include getting much income in the door, but, I wasn't making much as a lecturer before that. So I was able to float it for a few months. So I started out taking a course through Design Lab, which is an online kind of program in research and UX research and strategy. And it's a 4 to 5 week course They set you up with a real mentor who's in UX. They're usually a designer because they don't really have necessarily researchers. Maybe they do now. This was a while ago. And you can do like a little dummy project of your own. So that wasn't really a real project, but I had at least exposure to some of the deliverables that would be expected. You know, I did an empathy map. I did a storyboard. I did a small journey map. I did a little bit of usability testing, just some small things, personas. And so I had some idea of that. And then I started interviewing for jobs. And I kept getting to kind of the final round and then not getting the job because I didn't have experience. And I just got frustrated. So I went to Boulder Startup Week, which was a great opportunity. You know, when things are in person again, it's a little easier to meet people. Sure. There are ways to do it, though, in a remote world, to reach out to people. And I met two female founders of startups who were interesting. And I kind of reached out to them and just said, hey, could you use some work? So I did month-long projects for each of them kind of concurrently. Spent about 4 weeks, and it was so much easier to interview after doing those two projects because I had something to talk about. You know, I could actually speak to working in a space. Yeah. So, you know, one was kind of, they were dependent on the problems that the startups were having. One was for a study abroad software. And so I talked to students at university. I kind of talked to people who are using the software. I talked to people who are using a competitor software, figuring out kind of like where the gaps were, making some recommendations there. And then I learned kind of the value of stakeholder interviews during that project because, you know, half of what you do is research with the people you're doing the project for. Yeah. And then I did another one in the healthcare space. It was an app that was intended to make healthcare more equitable and accessible. So did some research with community health clinics. And it was really helpful. I mean, I was very open to whatever they needed me to do. And it's been valuable. It was absolutely valuable. And there's issues with doing volunteer projects. I think you should get paid for work you do. Sure. But when you're just getting started, it's important to just have a little bit of experience.
Yeah. It's a tough thing to recommend to anybody that they do free work. But somehow you got to find the work. And you brought up another point in there that is something that comes up with people I talk to a lot, which is, when it comes to boot camps, or in your case, like the Design Lab program, most, like you say, are design focused. Very few I've come across are research focused. And so I oftentimes caution to people that, if they want to do one, that's great, but just keep in mind that probably most things you're going to do are like producing designed assets, and the research component might be 1 week or whatever. And I think it's good to reiterate that, just so that people maybe don't possibly spend many thousands of dollars in some cases, if that's not what they're looking for. And it brings up the distinction between UX research and UX design. And, just it's good to always kind of make that distinction, so that I think a lot of anthropologists are interested in the research piece and less in the design. So I think it's just helpful to call that out for anybody listening. So aside from Design Lab, did you do anything else to upscale? Obviously there's some tech language, some business language, some basic knowledge that's helpful. Did you look at any other, do you do any other like certs online or anything that, will help you sort of make the transition?
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. And the Design Lab course, I like that because it wasn't very expensive. So I recommend that because it's not, unless you can swing it, it's not really worth doing more school after you've already done a bunch of school. To switch over, unless you're really interested in design, in which case boot camp might be useful. I think that the most upskilling that I did was I'd kind of networked with some local people who were in the UX research space and asked them, where would you recommend I start? And they gave me some really good resources. Idea has a lot, on iterative design. And I started kind of learning about design thinking and how you can use that kind of problem-solving approach for research projects. And I also just did a little bit of Google research on UX research and just tried to figure out, what are the deliverables that you're expected to produce? How should this look? I did a little research on agile product development as well, because a lot of this research goes into a product development process, and you have to kind of figure out how to fit that in. Honestly, I didn't really learn how that all worked until I worked in an agile development shop and was working closely with designers and developers, figuring out, how is a backlog built? What is a user story? How does research go into these things? How do you build a good prototype and then test that? And those are things that are hard to learn without doing them, but you can learn about them beforehand.
Did your first custom software development company, were they agile, or did you start in another environment and move to agile?
No, they were agile. So I've been working in that environment since then.
That's great. And so, obviously there's the agile space is very different than academia in terms of the pace and the cadence that we're building and releasing products. So were there any particular challenges there for you?
Of course. I mean, the pace is much faster, and you're kind of asked to turn research around very quickly. And I think it's helpful to remember that this is research for completely different goals than academia. Academia is a little, you have the time to kind of understand something in a more holistic sense. And these agile, product development questions are often very targeted. Like, what do insurance agents in this particular industry struggle with? And what do they need in terms of, something that software can provide them? And it's good to know their context, and it's good to bring that holistic viewpoint. But you do have to turn it around quickly. So as I tell people, anything is possible. You can put any kind of constraints on research that you want. There are limitations to what you can produce in a given time with the resources that you have. And so you can say, yes, I can take 3 weeks to do this, and this is what you'll get out of that. It's good to not, overpromise.
Sure.
Always.
Do you ever, sort of state it as, we can do it in 3 weeks and you'll get this, or we could do it in 6 weeks and you'll get this, and let them pick? Or
I've started to, yeah. Sometimes I do research proposals in kind of the silver, gold, platinum format, and I want them to choose the middle one. So you can kind of say, here's the bare bones, here's the mid-range, and then here's all the stops, and then they usually pick the middle. But it's nice for them to have a choice.
Yeah, I find the same. I try to always give them the options, let them know what the outcome may be, and then it's the outcome is their decision ultimately. What they want to get out of it, and especially in consulting, right, when there's sort of a fee for service sour to it, I think it's helpful to do it that way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, we're talking about the pace here of being quicker. Tell me some other things about what your day looks like. I mean, you're not researching all the time. There's lots of other duties as a UX researcher, right? There's lots of non-research duties. So what does a typical sort of day, week, month look like for you?
Sure. So most of what I do is not the actual research. And, but it's always helpful to remember, no matter what I'm doing, I do feel like I have a responsibility to be the voice of the people who I'm talking to. And that's the way for the organizations to kind of know what's going on with them. So that really does motivate me. I think that I spend quite a lot of time scoping projects. I work for a consultancy now, so I do business development and writing research proposals, kind of figuring out, what should this look like? How much time will this take? What activities should we do? And you can kind of, it's hard to get a sense of, what future projects will take, and you want it to be a good project for whoever takes it up in the end. Mm-hmm. So it's good to kind of learn about scoping and what is needed in a project, so you can do that. I also do a lot kind of after the research phase is finished. synthesizing data, analyzing, getting insights, and then using that to help the stakeholder team. And we do a lot of workshops with stakeholders. We do a lot of kind of interactive meetings, not just readouts, of what we found. So it's really using that research data to make decisions and build, what the product's going to look like.
And so, in terms of the interactive presentations, do you find that is helpful? Does that lend itself to people sort of really, embody, like really taking on the findings and helping you more or less sell it?
Oh, absolutely. It's invaluable. I think if you give people a chance, stakeholders a chance to really look at the data themselves and then say, what they think is most important. They vote on things. They move stickies around. We're doing all remote workshops now, so we use Miro a lot. And they really get into it. They get invested in it, and they have good discussions. And that's where a lot of the work gets done, I think, is having them interact with the data.
And as it relates to scoping, so obviously when sort of scoping out a project, you have to decide, given time, cost, all of those sort of variables, what methods, and the given need at hand, what methods are we going to use? Can we get X done in such amount of time? So how does your anthropological schooling sort of lend itself to that? Do you find yourself using certain methods more than others in the UX world? Can you talk about all of that?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm, of course, at home with qualitative methods and interviews, because I've just done a ton of those. But I find that I'm using more and more kind of concepts in those interviews and kind of having people react to something. So it's kind of a prototype test, but more like a concept assessment. So have, do maybe some generative work early on in the interview to kind of figure out what they're doing currently, and then show them something and say, how would you use this? Is this useful to you? What would you do with this? What would you suggest? All of those things. And I think that's something that I never used to do in my anthropological work, is have them kind of work with a thing. I also have become more comfortable with, I work with behavioral scientists now who do a lot of surveys. And I think that data can be incredibly useful. So kind of, I've become more comfortable integrating survey data with my interview data as well.
And in what order? Are you using sort of your qual to influence that, to influence the survey design, or you're learning from the survey and then?
It depends on the design of the project. We actually just did one where we used a survey to help structure the interviews and diary studies. And then that informed another survey that we did. So it was kind of like a tiered approach, which was fantastic. Yeah, worked really well.
Yeah, using them together in a very iterative way is helpful for sure. So you wrote an article in the American Ethnologist that's, a really great article that I think all the listeners should check out. If they sort of Google your name in American Ethnologist, they'll find it. But and we'll put it in the show notes. But in there, you speak of anthropological thinking, and it's obviously there are certain things that we learn in an academic program that, I think we would agree lend itself to that. But, that was a really nice piece of that article. So would you mind elaborating on that and sharing, with the listeners what, how you view anthropological thinking?
Sure. I think it has to do with kind of an iterative thinking in scale. So we're very used to kind of looking at the details of things and then pulling back to abstraction. And we have to do that over and over in doing field work and then figuring out, what does it mean? And we do that also in the reading that we do in an anthropological program. You have to read something and then you have to think about it abstractly. And it just, it's a skill that I think we become used to. And that's very helpful because often in UX research, you kind of lose sight of what the woods are like because you're in the trees so much. And it's really our job, I think, to get that detail and then be able to put it into a context and say, why does this matter? What is the value of this? What is the larger question we're asking? Are we even asking the right questions? And I think anthropologists are skeptics, and we're good at that. We're good at saying, you're making a lot of assumptions here. Let's go see if those assumptions check out before we go and do this whole big project. And so I think that helps the UX research process because it's really about making good decisions and figuring out how to spend valuable dollars in developing a product. It takes a lot to develop a product, and it's a big pain if you have to rework something or if you develop something that isn't useful and people don't like it and people can't figure out how to use it. So I think we're also very good at kind of listening. And this helps us within organizations and in our jobs is kind of listening to people who might use products. But especially within organizations, we can be really good mediators and kind of like negotiate between, the design team and the product strategy team and the developers or the tech leads or the architects, and kind of get everybody onto the same page about why are we doing this thing and what do we need to keep sight of. And that's also a valuable skill. I also think we're very open to kind of ambiguity. A lot of UX research and product development is very ambiguous. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what the right answer is. And so I think anthropologists kind of sit well in that space because we're often asking these big questions that don't have real answers, not definitive answers. We're looking at things that are fundamentally, they're pretty subjective. They have to do with meaning. They have to do with value. And those are hard things to define. Sure. So we're good at negotiating those waters that can be a little difficult.
So they're hard to define, but they are also sometimes hard to convince people of, I find, in the end. And so, that gets to sort of a topic that I ask a lot of people who work in the space. And I'm always interested in, how are different practitioners essentially systematizing, or maybe not systematizing, in any formal way, but how, what are you doing to preserve your findings for organizational memory? Because I've seen, I've done myself research where, there's this finding, it's very applicable in the short term, but, you're a year on and people are seeming to forget, the previous finding and how that relates to the product strategy. And
Sure.
So do you do anything personally or organizationally, if you can speak about it, that tries to systematize those findings or tries to preserve them and make them searchable? Anything in that space?
I think we've when I worked at a product accelerator for 2 years before this position in the consultancy, and we did create kind of a research repository there. And I don't know if anyone ever looked at it except researchers, but it was useful for researchers. We created a wiki on Confluence, which was that was more useful because developers use Confluence. Mm-hmm. They love it. And so they could go to our website essentially and kind of learn more about our process, learn more about, what we do. We had things on there like how to take good research notes, what we found in certain projects. We did research snapshots where we kind of summed up, how a project went. We did some lunch and learn presentations, talking about, how we'd made impact with different projects. So I think, reaching the audience where they are is important. In terms of research repository, I have not seen something that works terribly well yet, although I know a lot of places are trying. I think for me, the thing that stays in an organization, and this is true of where I am now, is kind of the process. like figuring out, how do you do a project? And we've created kind of an insights playbook to walk people through, how do you start a project? How do you scope it? What do you think about? What's the timeline? What are your deliverables like? How do you create them? What's the format? And, it's not set in stone. There are a lot of different options of how to do it. But I think those are probably the most valuable assets that an organization can work on to preserve kind of at least the way they approach research.
So, one thing that comes to mind when you say all that is there's really a lot of project management sort of activities in there, if you will, which I don't think a lot of, say, students or even early to mid-career anthropologists who might not be in tech are anticipating. As you come into tech, I think we have to take on a lot of that, and it moves pretty quick. And so, I know we already kind of talked about some upskilling, but is there anything that you did particularly around like project management, or was it just sort of self-study?
I wish I'd done more of that. That would have been super helpful. I think the product management skills that I took in to this career were designing my own research and running it. And then I did a lot of organizing of conferences, of panels, of various, group events. And that was sort of like something that I was really involved in grad school. And I think those skills were kind of helpful because you kind of can like put together a program based on a bunch of different people doing different things. And about timelines and about deadlines and can kind of organize people that way. So I think it would be incredibly helpful to take product management classes or do something a little more formal. I know there's a lot of certifications on the web. There are things you can kind of courses you can go through to learn about it. And I don't know if it needs to be specific to tech or not. I think that would be useful. Learning about, agile product management would definitely be useful.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So you talked about previously, you talked about the lunch and learns. So that's, you sort of shopping around the findings, right? And a part of that, I think is, or related to that at least, is another big topic that oftentimes comes up in, when I'm talking to UXers and when I'm talking to just the business anthropology community at large. And it's like the general topic about how do we sort of gauge, the impact of our work. I think in UX that can be a little easier than maybe in like an organizational anthropology or anthropologists who are working in branding. It seems like, we with sort of the analytics platforms maybe have like a little bit more of a concrete way to do that oftentimes. But do you have any thought on, like how do you gauge the impact of your own research, or how do the stakeholders that you're selling it to gauge that?
Oh gosh, it's hard. It's hard to come up with, real measurable indicators of impact. And sometimes it's kind of like you have to think about development effort and kind of like, how much effort would this thing have been that we didn't build because research told you it wasn't valuable? And that's kind of like, how much money did you not spend? Which is hard to measure. I think success of a project can be measured maybe in kind of alignment with the team, how much they kind of understand about the people who will use the product, and kind of how invested they are in making something that matches those needs. So I think a lot of it comes out, rather after the fact, that research is done, and hopefully research is kind of like you can be part of something long term and kind of see it. But in consulting, where I am now, we don't really see where the product necessarily goes or what happens, in this like large digital transformation experience. But we do know that we're bringing teams together that didn't know quite how to do a large project before. And we know that they're able to talk about it, and they have a direction, and they have a roadmap, and they are in a better place than they were before. So I think that has impact. But you do need to bring these measures up with leadership now and then. And engineers that I've worked with tend to really like the value to effort matrix. So if you can map a set of features along how valuable it is to users and how much effort it would take on the development side, if you can work with the development team to do that, then you can have a grid that shows you which features have high impact for users or high value and are not too much effort to build or a little bit of effort. And that kind of is like an aha moment, I think. And
it really helps for prioritizing, for sure.
Yeah. And it's in a format that is very understandable and makes decisions more clear. So I think our role is really helping people make decisions in a better way.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Also when you said earlier about maybe helping the organization not build something that maybe they shouldn't, but in many ways it's sort of about reducing risk in a lot of cases. But you're also saying some things in there that happen to, it would depend on the organization and how it's sort of defined, but you're doing a number of things that maybe a product manager might do in some cases, depending on the size of the team and how maybe mature their organization is. So how do you work together, in this role or in previous, what do you find, how are you working with the product manager?
It depends on who, like what role they're in at different organizations. They play, there are various iterations of a project manager or product manager or product owner, or there's a lot of different words. And I think it comes down to, who is responsible for kind of the vision of the project and where it's going. And it really helps when there is a person who is responsible for that. Sometimes project managers play more of the role of kind of making sure all the meetings happen on time and notes are, given, and kind of coordinating all the different people. And then sometimes the tech lead might take on that role of, the product vision person. And sometimes nobody's taking on that role and it's really tough. So, and then sometimes UX research takes on that role and can pull people together around that vision.
And it is well suited for it, which brings up another thing, which is that UX research today, we don't quite have a seat at the table in a lot of cases, or at least higher up in the organization. Research still seems to be sort of nestled under something else, whether it's sort of design or product in a lot of places, not everywhere, of course. It depends on maturity, but in those cases, or in your case, when maybe you don't have, somebody who's really taking on the product vision, what do you do to sort of exert your influence, and what could other people maybe do? Any tips for how that they can really make sure that the research gets, has impact ultimately, that it gets adopted?
I think the most important thing you can do is bring people into the research process with you. So they are kind of helping make these decisions along with you, because that can really help with buy-in. And if you just have sort of, you give them, insights or ideas and say, this is where it should go, they may not adopt that or be very interested. But if you can say, hey, can you help me figure out where this should go? And I can help give you these tools, and let's figure this out together, what this product should be. And then they really get into it and are excited about it.
That's great.
So
along the lines of recommendations, I'd like to maybe pivot and talk about what the listeners could do if they want to get into UX. So that could be students, could be early career, mid-career, whatever it may be. Whether the needs are a little different, right? If you're a student, you have some time to plan and maybe do some upskilling ahead of time, take some classes, whatever it may be. You can sort of structure that. If you're already working, then it's more a question about maybe how do you reframe your experience to get into tech. So maybe first for students, is there anything that stands out that you would recommend that they do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that gaining some work experience is critical before you graduate, because no one will see anything that you did as a student for like your, if it's a dissertation, whatever it is, as work experience. Even if it's applied, even if it's a research project, for a company. If it's for a company, maybe they'll give you a job afterwards. But barring that, usually, it's interesting background, but it's not work. So if you can, as a student, you can get internships that are not available once you graduate. So I strongly recommend taking advantage of those, and your graduate programs, or if you're an undergrad, your program will not help you necessarily in finding these. So you'll have to find them on your own, word of mouth. A lot of big companies have them. And I can't stress enough, just, I wish I'd had that. That would have helped me a lot. And you can also start taking courses in some other departments. Go check out, it would have helped me to have a little better background in statistics, honestly. So make friends with your sociology buddies and go figure out what they're doing. Because it's really helpful to kind of at least know what the quantitative side looks like, so that you can do that. If you need to pull on that tool later, you can do that. There are some programs in computer science that are focused on kind of product and agile product and management. The business school might have something related to strategy. Could be really useful. So I recommend, get out of your bubble and go see what else is on campus. Design, of course. The design program might be a great place to start to find something that would help. And
how about for those who are working, any tips for maybe reframing their experience on a resume and a portfolio?
Oh, sure. Well, if you're not in the UX research space and you want to get in and you have research experience, that is great. I've worked with amazing UX researchers who've come from biological science, who've come from, neuroscience, or all kinds of business, all kinds of different backgrounds, right? And they all have in common being able to take, collect data and then critically think about it. So if you can package up your experience in that way, that goes a long way. Can you put a case study on your portfolio that says, what's the problem? What did you do about it? What was the impact? If you can show that you did good research that fits that form, I don't think it has to be in the UX space necessarily. But it sure does help to have a few UX type projects on your portfolio.
Yeah, and you on your own website, which I encourage everybody to look up. There's, in the FAQ section, you talk about the portfolio, and it's, it's a good breakdown of it. You mentioned one other thing in there that I wanted to touch on, which is strategy. So, maybe this isn't, maybe this isn't for like sort of a junior UX research role, but as we sort of mature, there's other opportunities for us as UX researchers. We can continue on in the UX research path and maybe specialize. We could also venture out. I myself at this time am spending more time in the product management space, but strategy is also a really interesting area. And so maybe, do you want to say anything particularly about strategy, but also about maybe just, sort of career path as a UX researcher?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as you kind of get into a mid-career, place, you have more choices. You can say, what do I really want to specialize in now? And there are quite a few more roles coming up that have strategist in the title, or people are becoming kind of UX research strategists or lead strategists. And I think this has to do with kind of, basically strategy is choice making. How do you make a choice? How do you decide how to spend resources? And there are various approaches to this. I took a great course with Idea on strategic decision making, or I think it was called Design Strategy, Roger Martin's course, and it's a great framework for kind of thinking about how you make choices. And that is pretty much what we do. We help people make choices informed by data. And it's data that we actually collect on the ground, outside the organization. And so hopefully it's a better informed choice. But strategy is absolutely a direction that UX researchers can go in. I've also seen quite a lot of uptick in kind of realizing that anthropologists and social scientists are good at figuring out kind of ethics within technology. And there are a lot more roles kind of for people who are thinking deeply about the ethical implications of technological decisions. And I think that's a good space for us as well. So I think the technology world is really opening up to what anthropologists can bring, and realizing kind of that holistic understanding of human behavior and human motivations is useful in a lot of different areas, and not just in, UX research specifically.
Yeah, for sure. And, with every company at this point, not just the tech companies per se, not just the Googles and Facebooks, but with every company really now trying to build digital products, the job market is just, exploding for us. And so it's a really great place to be. And so,
Yes.
In closing, maybe, I guess one is, is there anything I didn't ask that you think would be good to bring up?
Maybe just to reiterate that graduate programs in anthropology are doing great work by training anthropologists. And then they are not doing great work in helping them figure out what to do with their training. And so I think there's a big space there for graduate programs to think about, doing, a hybrid curriculum with maybe a design program or technology, putting something together that fits this space in a way that kind of shows anthropology majors and graduate students that there is a path. There are many different paths, and getting them the training and getting them prepared for that job market, because it is a big market. And so far, people are kind of figuring it out on their own. There's a few programs, but not many.
Yeah, what would be very interesting in there too, just to add on to that, I'm personally interested in teaching cross-listed courses across, broadly speaking, art or design, business, and social sciences. And I would like to see all of those, people brought together, because not only is the subject matter useful for the different, players in that space, but imagine getting them together early on, very much like a product team, right? Mm-hmm. And sort of that actual sort of real applied training of working together across disciplines. It's a really ripe space, for innovation within education. So I hope somebody does it.
There's a space there for sure.
Great. So is there anything you're involved in that maybe you want to tell everybody about?
Well, I'm working on an early project for possibly grad programs. And I really do feel strongly about helping students figure out a means to gainful employment. Because I think you don't need to be poor forever, and you can have a job, and that's okay. So keep an eye out for that, but kind of an early project for that. And also, I'd like to just call out, the EPIC website, Ethnographic Praxis and Industry Conference, or epicpeople.org, has great resources on all of these things, from getting started to really people who've thought very deeply about a certain subject. And then the Napa Design by Anthropologists blog has fantastic resources for people starting out in this space. So I would recommend those. There are also a few organizations that help, PhDs transition to industry. So, there's Beyond the Professoriate. The professor is in, of course, has some resources, and From PhD to Life is another one. So there are a lot of kind of people in this space who can help you move more into industry, or at least, and there's a lot of free resources too. So, there's a research project to be done if you're getting started, but there are also people who can help you kind of figure this out.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing all those. And a note on EPIC. So just, the past day or two, I think it was, that they released all the 2020 materials. So
Yeah.
definitely check those out. Great.
Yeah.
And where can everybody find you?
Well, my website is rachelfleming.net. And I have links to things that I've written and a big, long FAQs page about UX research, because I thought I should just, instead of repeating myself all the time, just put it on the web.
And it's a great piece.
See it.
And that, and along with the American Ethnologist article, definitely one of the reasons I reached out to you first. I really thank you for coming on, being the first guest. You're a great first guest for this. I know you're passionate about the same thing. So Rachel, thanks very much.
Well, thanks so much for starting this. I think it's needed and it will have a great future.
Great. Appreciate it. Thanks.
So.